What's going on, guys? Welcome to another episode of Healthspan Academy. I'm your host, Craig Shearhart, and joining me today is my special guest, Dr. Stuart McGill, who is a world-renowned spine biomechanics expert. So he started his academic career with a bachelor in science in health and performance from University of Toronto, and then went on to do a master's in kin anthropology in biomechanics from University of Ottawa. Went on to get a PhD in kinesiology and biomechanics from University of Waterloo, and then spent 30 years working as a professor at the University of Waterloo and a few cross appointments. He's currently a distinguished university professor emeritus, and since 2002, he's been the chief scientific officer of BackFit Pro Inc. He's the author of 4 books, including Low Back Disorders and Back Mechanics, which I've got a copy of myself, which are excellent reads. He's the author of 245 peer-reviewed scientific papers. He's worked with professional powerlifters, bodybuilders, CrossFit Games athletes, and other pro athletes. And his CV is one of the longest ones I've ever seen. It's longer than my master's dissertation was, 129 pages. So I could go on with this bio, but just to get this conversation going, we'll cut it there. Dr. McGill, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, good morning, Craig. I think you're down in Guelph. Is that correct?
Yeah. I film here from Guelph, and I think we may have been neighbors at one point in Waterloo. My parents live on Faraday Court in Waterloo. So yeah.
I know your mom and dad.
Oh yeah, and Pauline.
I know your mom and dad. Well, what a small world. In fact, I shouldn't say this, you'll think I'm a voyeur, but I could look out my kitchen window where I would have breakfast and watch their TV. I knew what they were watching.
That's hilarious.
So I could look into 3 different kitchens, as a matter of fact, when I lived at the university.
That's so funny.
House.
Wow.
But lovely folks. Okay, well,
cool.
That's fabulous. I think you and I have met before then.
Maybe years ago. Yeah.
Yes.
I haven't lived there since, obviously in a little bit, but yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Small world. So I want to start the conversation with how biomechanics kind of came into your life. Was that something you were always kind of fascinated with growing up? Was it kind of sports injuries that kind of piqued your interest? Or how did you end up kind of narrowing your path into spine biomechanics?
Well, I've always been interested in the way things work. I was always interested in sport, and I played a little bit, enough to know that certain body types were really good at doing certain things. And I would wonder why. How come that guy would just move me out of the way on the defensive line on football gridiron? Or how come if we were having a roll on the ground, that person had wonderfully flexible shoulders and could come around and snap on an arm bar or something? And these sorts of things fascinated me. But I've said this on podcasts before. I wasn't really a good student in high school, but when I went to university, not really for academics, I went more to play sports, but nonetheless, I had some really wonderful professors. Nice. And I started taking some courses in physics. And the physics in high school to me was gobbledygook. It was equations, but I could feel the mechanics in my hands. But university brought it together that it really was the truth for me. You can't fight or argue against Newton's laws of motion, at least for everyday life and gravity. And this scientific truth was very attractive to me. I must have been lost one day, but I was in the library at University of Toronto. I saw a book called Biomechanics, and I picked it up and I looked inside, and there was the physics coupled with anatomy and different lever lengths. And
the eyes started to light up.
Yeah, they did.
Yeah.
And I didn't really know much more about it at that time. I was going to apply for a master's degree in astrophysics, but I thought, look, the biomechanics. So I applied for it, and I got in at University of Ottawa, and that. So there's the start.
Amazing. Very cool.
Silly story.
So obviously you've built an incredible career over the years. You work with some really big names. Are there certain people you were really excited to work with? Or is that kind of like the starstruck? Has that been long gone? Or who are the most people you were kind of looking forward to working with most over those years?
Well, there's a couple of elements that just came to mind as you asked that. Was I starstruck? Yes, obviously, that's my first tendency. But my father used to involve me in business decisions and things when I was a kid.
Okay.
And he always impressed upon me that whoever you are with at that time, you are their equal. Mm-hmm. So if it's an undergraduate student asking a question, at that time, you're their equal. If you're talking to Michael Jordan, or a superstar business person, mm-hmm. or whatever, that piece of advice has served very well. Or I meet someone out of one of the royal families, for example. Holy smokes, that's not my world.
Yeah.
But just treat them as your equal, and things always seem to work out. So yes, I'm starstruck, but I think, all right, I'm just going to sit down in front of the fireplace and speak like two friends wearing cardigans, sipping on a beer or a whiskey.
Amazing.
Or eating one of your mother's cookies. Anyway, so that's helped me greatly in that whole starstruck issue. But in terms of specific athletes, yes, there's been many. Now you realize I have to sign an NDA when I work with many of them. Particularly, some of them have enormous marketing empires and whatnot. So I would love to tell you about some of them and their stories, because
I don't want you to get
fascinating.
No worries.
So I can't. But another thought that came to mind was one of the greatest joys, Craig, was to feel their athleticism. And I'd always have a little bit of a joke with them at the beginning, and I'll say, good, I'm going to show you what I know about the back, and can we help with your back situation? Because that's the ultimate reason why anyone would ever come and see me.
Right.
I'll show you what I know. Now you show me a little bit about what your magic is in their sport. And I can remember, we both grew up in Waterloo. Do you remember the gray silos driving range?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. So I took the world long drive champion came to see me, and they'd won the world long drive championship, not 2 years in a row, but there was a space in between. But it wasn't luck. Twice they hit a golf ball further than any other human.
That's wild.
And so we went out to the gray silos, and we took a bucket of balls, and we hit some balls, and every single ball went right out the end of the driving range into the cornfield. And then the owner came out, and they give you lousy balls, right? These aren't great balls to hit. They're like hitting rocks.
Yeah.
But anyway, every ball went out over the end, and this guy came out very perturbed, and he says, who is this person? Losing every single ball.
Yeah.
And I said who it was. And anyway, just to hit a few balls with them, and I'm not a golfer, but just to feel the awesome power in their gift was
very
amazing.
Cool to witness it up close.
Yeah. Or if you get, an MMA athlete, and just to have the privilege of rolling on a mat with them, and to feel how easy they can just do whatever they want with you. I'll give you an example of that. I was with one household name in MMA. I'm not going to say who it is, but I said, okay. And I got a bit sort of cocky, and I said, try and get an arm bar. 2 seconds. And I thought, well, I can defend an arm bar. 2 seconds, he had it. And I said, can you explain to me what you just did? And it was medical science to the nth degree.
Wow.
And he said, I was sensing your breathing, and I let you exhale, because when you exhale, you get soft.
Right.
And then he said, when you exhaled, I dug your liver flex. You brought your arm down to cover your liver reflex, and you gave me your arm, you idiot.
That's wild. That's wild.
So to go through many, many different sports, and to get them to show me, and I get to play with their awesomeness.
Yeah. That's something that most people don't get to witness. You see them on TV, you see the athleticism, but you don't get the intelligence piece like you would unless you're playing on the field with them. So that's very cool. I can appreciate that.
The great ones aren't just, they are so far off the charts.
Yeah. That's wild.
It's awful. I see. Well, I won't get into that, but it's just, it's awful when I see armchair athletes making comments about athletes, on the television or something, and I just have to think to myself, they
looks so easy on the TV.
nothing.
Yeah,
They know nothing.
So true. I love that. So obviously, a lot of your work has been mitigating injuries. We know the best way to sort of avoid that is by avoiding them to begin with, that kind of prophylactically. So I want to talk a little bit about injury prevention pieces. So we've got these different variables we can work with: technique, load, volume, programming, mobility, recovery, core strength. When we're talking specifically about back preventative measures, what do you prioritize first if you're kind of guiding someone in trying to avoid back injury altogether?
The way I would think about answering that question is at two levels. The first would be the individual level. We need someone in front of us, understand the mechanism that's led them down this path to pain or injury or whatever it is. And then I have another one at a higher program level for a team of athletes or an industry of workers, for example. So let me start with the individual, and it takes me back to last week. A CrossFit coach contacted me because I'd worked with one of his athletes, and he got better and back to competition. And the coach said, "How did you do that? My back is..." Anyway, the coach is now in his 40s and heavily episodic. And after interviewing him, the pattern was he would upset his back to the point where he had to take 3 months off. He became a baby. He couldn't lift. He couldn't tie his shoes. He couldn't roll in bed. It is terribly miserable. But he would get better. And guess what he did? He went back to CrossFit and had a training session. So you asked me the question, is it load, volume, programming, mobility? For him, it is not understanding the biological process. Just because you are out of pain doing everyday activities only means that you didn't hit the pain threshold doing everyday activities. You did not you, but him, he didn't have enough capacity to add a step input of a CrossFit workout. He hadn't earned the capacity biologically. So it was really a programming error and a failure to understand the process of biological healing and adaptation. So I explained that to him, and he said, "Yes, I understand that. Very good." So there would be an example where we then coached a plan to build a foundation of core stability, appropriate mobility at his hips and shoulders, appropriate movement patterns that transferred onto the gym at CrossFit. And every time he introduced a new activity, use a 3-day rolling cycle. He didn't, this was all foreign to him. In other words, if you want to start swimming or riding your bike and then doing multiple Olympic lifts, on the first day of riding your bike, go ride 5 minutes, no more. Let's see where your capacity to handle that is. And then on day 2, it's baby simply steps. An audit day. Don't do any more. Did your body thrive with the previous 5-minute bike ride? Or did you get the warning signal? No, you don't even have 5 minutes yet. So it's a wonderful way. Don't do any more on day 2. Simply audit. Day 3, if you got the green light from your body, now cycle 9 or 10 minutes.
Just
day 4, audit your body. And that 3-day rolling cycle is really magical for returning a lot of people. But that's all programming.
So easy to get excited when you're pain free that first day and just want to jump right back into things. So just, like
haven't we all been there?
100%. Especially if it's your living, it's your livelihood. If you're a pro athlete, of course, you want to get back out there as quick as you can. But that's great advice.
There's huge pressures in pro sport. But with the internet pressures these days, people are training like pro athletes. And they put themselves under these artificial pressures. And they. The guy, one of the Gracies, the guy who started the UFC, he has a really interesting saying: "Slow down, I'm in a hurry."
Interesting.
Think about that.
That's wild.
And your recovery, slow down, you'll get there faster. But I did mention the second level that my brain goes to in answering those questions.
The more global kind of level.
So I think of we were contacted by a major tire manufacturing plant. So these guys lift heavy rubber tires and all the building materials that go into them and whatnot. But they were paying out a certain number, well over in this plant, millions of dollars on direct compensation payouts for back injury. So we knew what that number was.
Right.
Then they came to us and said, can you help us put in a prevention program? So we trained their company occupational health nurse, and we put in one of our people, a kinesiologist, who we ended up calling a job coach. So they would look at the various tasks and look for ways to make the tasks more joint and spine friendly. So that was changing the job and the industrial process, but they
just kind of classic ergonomics.
Classic ergonomics, which change the task to fit the worker.
Right.
It doesn't change the worker, but a job coach actually does an assessment of each worker and says, you know, when you bend that way, you put a stress concentration in this part of your body. In you, it's your back. That's why you've been having repeated back episodes. So they would coach the way that they move with some movement training patterns. Long story short, after the following year, their direct compensation costs for back injuries was cut to 1/5. They had a 5 times reduction. Now, we knew what the cost to the company of training the nurse, putting in our job coach, etc. So the company gained a 5-to-1 return on investment. And that's what businesses don't, I hate to say it, but they look at the money savings. They don't really look at the human suffering of their workers with back pain and the social costs of bad being, that sort of stuff. So there's just an example, and I could pull out some other examples over our career, but there's a personal prevention story and strategy, and more of a global team industrial example. Yeah.
So just to kind of like pull this together, what I'm hearing is that it's not any one variable. It's, you have to kind of find the lowest hanging fruit or the most pressing variable, wherever there's kind of a biggest gap. If the programming is the issue, then that's the issue, right? You kind of start with what may not be ideal and kind of work them forward from there. Is that more or less?
Sure. Yeah. You could put a person on their hands and knees and ask them to rock their buttocks back to their heels. And if you see the whole pelvis shift over and you say, well, why are you doing that? And they say, well, my knee hurts.
Yeah.
And then you go and watch them lift a load. And every time they lift, they have to shift around to preserve the knee.
Yeah.
Guess what? It's
where we start.
The linkage mechanics in that particular person. The next person, they don't rest enough to allow the adaptations to occur. The next person just doesn't understand. They have an open fissure disc bulge, which is a very specific cause.
Right.
And no one in their whole experience has ever showed them the very specific cause of why they continue to stay pained and never get better. So it's the assessment. Always
start with the assessment as opposed to starting with anything. Don't make any assumptions.
Would you I'm going to frame this a different way. Would you take your car to a car mechanic and say, my car isn't working well, and that's it? And then they say, oh, well, for cars that don't work well, we change the engine.
Yeah. There's a little bit of problem solving involved.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Cool. I want to talk about the concept of neutral spine. This has been something that I've taken completely to heart. It's one of the first things we teach the athletes kind of when they come into the gym. We talk about the importance of good posture. So we know that it's a good kind of solid, stable, preventative kind of position where also we optimize performance. There's also like higher loads we can tend to produce in a neutral spine. What is it about that position that's so important when we start to get into functional lifting or gymnastics or pieces like that?
So using the term functional lifting, you mean as required by a gym lifter or a gymnast or something like that. I'm
sure. Classic
struggling a bit.
Classic powerlifting, weightlifting, gymnastics. Like maybe not anything that's kind of non-odd objects. Kind of like the conventional compound lifts, I guess, that you'd see.
I understand now. Yeah. Okay. any discussion like this needs a context. And I know a lot of people discuss this. They go in circles because they don't have a context.
Mm-hmm.
We need a person in front of us to give us context.
Right.
So the neutral spine is a posture.
Mm-hmm.
If we go back, I mean, Peter O'Sullivan, I don't know if you know that name.
I know the name.
But he's a good scientist from Western Australia,
Mm-hmm.
University of Western Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And he did work, I think he published it around 2010.
Mm-hmm.
And he did a study where he took a group of low back pain people and does posture matter? And his conclusion was, no, it doesn't really matter. However, he then subcategorized.
Okay.
And he would have people, and if they sit upright, they have no pain. And then when they slouch, if that flexion position and causes the person to say, oh yeah, there's my pain.
Mm-hmm.
They are a flexion pain triggered person.
Right.
Now flexion matters to them. So
Interesting.
you have to subcategorize.
Right.
You can't do any of this discussing non-specific low back pain. And in fact, as you may know, in our world, it doesn't exist.
Yeah.
We always subcategorize.
Sure.
Now, he also had a category of extension-driven pain.
Hmm.
Extend back. Oh, yeah, there's my trigger.
Yeah.
Now, for an extension-triggered back, extension postures matter.
Right.
But not flexion. So do you see how...
So we start assessing kind of unloaded. And obviously,
right.
we want to find that pain-free position unloaded before we go and load it.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, if you're talking about just the lay public coming into the gym for a bit of a workout, and I'll hear them argue, "Oh, is butt wink okay?" And one trainer says, "Oh yeah, butt wink is okay. Get out of position. You're in there in life. You might as well train it."
Sure.
I say, really? Well, let's put a bar on your back, and we'll stand up. And now I want you to do a pelvic tilt. Flex and extend your spine 10 times. How do you feel? Oh, my back feels sick. It doesn't like that. Guess what? For you, butt wink and flexion is a problem.
Right.
But then we get into issues of the mechanical variables that cause pain, increase risk, and all the rest of it. We did a study on Middle Eastern belly dancers, Craig. You'll find this kind of interesting. And we would watch these women do the most amazing spine flexion, extension, rotation, muscles in and out, and really fascinating mechanics. But there was no load.
Right.
They weren't picking up any loads, and they could move their spine around. They didn't really report any back pain. But then we did some, let's call them exercises and tests. You know, I don't think there was a woman there that struggled doing a sit-up.
Oh, really?
So, yes, they were wonderfully mobile, but not strong. And this is where we get into issues. Remember that experiment for the people who want to argue about butt wink? Start with a bare bar. Now put 100 kilo on the bar and repeat and tell me how you now feel. So load compounds with the spine posture to accelerate or limit the variables that lead to pain. So if we were to take a person who has a disc bulge, well, the fastest, most potent way that we've discovered over our 30 years is to get a disc bulge is, and I know for your YouTube viewers who can see the visual, they will get what I mean. So a disc is not a ball and socket joint. It's a fabric. It's a collection of collagen fibers crisscrossing one another, building a fabric. Now, if my shirt is also a fabric, and I'm going to create stress strain reversals back and forth, and slowly a hole will appear at where it's experiencing these stress strain reversals. So there's a fabric, just like a biological fabric of a disc, and I'm going to do some stress strain reversals, and you see the delaminations that I just caused in the fabric.
Equivalent to damaging your collagen.
Yes. Yeah. So the more the range of the stress strain reversals and the greater the load, you get more stress and more strain, which then causes these fibers to delaminate if you flex more and more under load.
Mm-hmm.
And then eventually the person, when we flex forward, you see the collagen opening up. There's what we call an open fissure disc bulge.
Right.
And then other curious things happen.
Mm-hmm.
When you get that path of delamination through, you've got a disc bulge. But now look what the body does. Do you see the yellow fibers are the nerves that ingrow and sprout? They sprout more into the area that has been delaminated, together with peripheral sprouting of vascular structures.
Right.
So it becomes more vascularized and more nerves to sense pain even more.
Right.
But here's another curious thing. In the virgin spine, the person who's never had delamination occurring to the point of pain before, the first time they get a knife in the back, performing a lift where they're getting out of position, and they've accumulated enough of a history of stress strain reversals that the nucleus is slowly working through the delaminations, and then it hits the last layer, bam, it extrudes. It sets off an incredible inflammatory process because the nucleus, I don't know how much science stuff you want to get into here, but the nucleus, the day of neurulation, which the embryo is fertilized, and then somewhere around a month later, that flat disc rolls into the primitive fetal embryo. It's called neurulation.
Right.
That's the day that the nucleus starts to form and grows, but it's sealed up. It never receives the antibody environment from the mother. So the first time that nucleus breaches through the delaminations, the immune system, the immune system sets off this incredible inflammatory process. Very, 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 very painful. But after it has occurred, then the white blood cells, macrophage activity either digests the extruded material. If you stop the offense of squeezing it and bending it and
knock that off.
all the rest of it, and it will plug. It goes to like a crab meat. It comes out as a gel, and then the immune system turns it into a crab meat plug. And it grows vascular and neural structures, as I said. But anyway, there's a little bit of a thought. But the second part of your question has to do with performance. And if we were to take a jib crane, and we're going to attach a cable to the jib crane, and the elbow is the fulcrum, that wire pulls the jib crane up and you create a very athletic performance. Now, assume the jib crane was a flexible piece of spaghetti. You could pull it and the spaghetti would just bend. So let's take an Olympic lifter. When an Olympic lifter gets into the lifter's wedge and the hip power extends the hips, and I'm talking about an Olympic lift with acceleration now. If the spine bends, you have what we call an energy leak.
Right.
Think of the amount of effort designers and engineers put into mechanical structures that transmit power into stiffness.
Right.
In an F1 car frame, you spend a hell of a lot of money building a stiff frame. A racing pedal bike, you spend a lot of money in a stiff frame, because if you push on the crank arm and the pedal and the frame bends,
wobble, you're losing all that power.
You're losing all the power that should have been driven to driving the wheel. And so your body's exactly the same. You want to arrest energy leaks. Stiffer in terms of power transfer is by far the best and the least amount of energy loss. You don't see too many not power lifters, Olympic lifters who lift at speed with a wonky, flexible spine. It is locked and the hips drive, and they put a lot of effort in creating that stiff link. But then, we look at other athletes, I think of going back to working with elite athletes. I was consulting with an NFL football team down in the U.S.
Okay.
And we were just on the practice field, and the quarterback had suffered quite a back injury. And being a quarterback, he'd had his shoulder, his throwing arm, dislocated a number of times. So he's got a compromised shoulder, his spine, he's got a couple of disc bulges. He had to learn how to throw with his hips.
Right.
Much more hips in throwing. And he throws me a ball. And this ball is flatlining, coming at me. I don't know how fast they throw. And then I caught the ball, and I know enough about football. It almost knocked me over, Craig. Wow. But my point was, he had learned to stiffen and control his spine, to engineer out the pain and the energy loss, still to throw a ball competitively in the NFL. Those guys chuck that ball 80 yards.
That's wild.
It's amazing. So we can talk and give examples after example. Oh, now let's be a scientist and make a counterpoint to all of this.
Sure.
I remember being in Poland just after the Russian glasnost. So what was that? 1990, somewhere around there.
Okay.
And there were two, they invited some scientists from different countries to come in and discuss some of the Soviet science that was all hidden from us. And we were looking at some of the cosmonaut data on the spines and backs, which was fabulous. But anyway, I went to a scoliosis clinic where scoliosis is a frontal plane deviated curvature of the spine. Yeah. And I was watching some of the kids with scoliosis get trained, and they would hang out over the end of the table and create a fulcrum at the edge of the table with one part of their spine. And they would just work that one little part. And then they would cantilever out a little bit further and then just work with that little part.
Just to improve the thoracic spine, I guess you're trying to mobilize.
Thoracic, lumbar, and not only mobilize, they were trying to connect the brain to the various neuromuscular compartments up and down the spine. Wow. So do you see, there's a different purpose, and now you want to educate segmental motion up and down the spine, but you probably don't want to do it Olympic lifting.
Yeah, you probably want a couple hundred kilos on your back doing that.
Right. But, if you take a contemporary dancer, a gymnast, a ballet person, you will probably have to broach that topic and figure out where all of those variables conspire together to create a performance metric and a risk metric. You want to mitigate that and enhance the performance. So it's a dance.
Sure.
But anyway, there's a little bit of a counterpoint.
Just going to say, there is a time and place for something like a Jefferson curl, right? It's not something you want to go loading crazy, but like there is some kind of value depending what the application is so more or less what you're saying.
Let me answer that one with a scientific principle.
Sure.
Every exercise is a tool, and you choose a tool to reach the goal in the most efficient way.
Right.
So my question back to you is, here's a person in front of you who either has been doing Jefferson curls or has really messed up their back by doing them or is thriving on them. What was the goal?
Right.
That's my first question, because I get asked that question a lot. And then I'll say, okay, was that the best goal? Was that the right goal? And was that the right tool to get to the goal?
Right.
And if they got hurt, something screwed up.
Yeah. Is the goal serving some kind of higher purpose there? Is you just you're doing the flashy thing on Instagram?
Thank you.
Yeah.
So now, having said all of that, I've worked with literally the strongest man in the world. And now, when you look at the size of the extensor muscles in their back, they are double mine.
Yeah,
they have double the moment arm. So if I wanted to use the muscle as a wrench, which you do, that's how you extend the spine. But now you've doubled the length of the moment arm for the same amount of muscle force and crush load to the spine. It's only half the load on the spine because you've doubled the moment arm.
Right.
So now let's not say a Jefferson curl as much as cantilevering the athlete's spine out over a bench, like a Roman chair. Let's put a 45-pound Olympic plate behind their head, and they start doing segmental extensions on their spine. Realize that they've been training their spine for 20 years. You don't become the world's strongest man when you're 18.
True.
It's usually a more mature strength.
Yeah.
The muscles are incredibly hypertrophied. And that's, truth be known, to connect your brain to every single neuromuscular compartment up and down your spine, which is the brain, with the way the brain organizes the neural drive to the erector spinae. Segmental motion is a very powerful training tool. But now's the question. How many reps do you do? What are you thinking when you're doing it? And, I think you've heard of Bill Kazmaier, world's strongest man. Yeah, of course, everyone has. Bill is a gem, just a legend, a lovely man. And I remember examining some of his training techniques, and we're going back 20 years. He did do an exercise where he would cantilever his thoracic spine, just like the kids did in Poland who had scoliosis, connecting his brain to the neuromuscular compartments up and down his spine, putting blocks underneath and all this kind of stuff.
Just to improve body control and
connect his brain. But now here's a funny thing. I told this story. I got to present Bill with a Lifetime Achievement Award at Swiss, the Society for Weightlifting,
International Federation of Weightlifting.
It's Ken Kanakin's group. Yeah,
gotcha.
Fantastic group. Anyway, he said, would you present this Lifetime Achievement Award to Bill? I said, wow, love to. I better think about it. So my story was this. I don't know if you want these stories,
let's have it.
So I had done some initial scientific investigations as to how the brain organizes the neuromuscular compartments, and then in assessing and trying to understand how Bill trained, he perfectly utilized that science to train and connect his brain to the neuromuscular. It wasn't training the muscle as much as it was getting his brain educated so he could lay on full neural drive and get full strength. And have that conversation with Bill, because the gold he gives of what he thinks about and prepares for a feat of strength, it's so much mind-body connection. Or the great Vasily Alexiev, the Russian super heavyweight. Fantastic strength of mind in creating that neural drive. But anyway, back to Bill. And then I said to him, well, how did you know that was the way to connect your brain for this super strength? And I was expecting, kind of a scientific answer, or, some scientist had told them that. And he just looked at me and said, Stu, I did it because it worked. Plain and simple. And I thought, and that was my story at the awards dinner. Wasn't that wonderful when science and the validity and proof of principle from the guy who actually did it both arrived at the same place? Yeah.
That's amazing.
And that. So anyway, there's a little bit of a thought on.
Awesome. So I'm curious to get your take on, so we've talked a little bit about loading mechanism, and I know you've done tons of testing kind of over the years and in vitro settings and stuff, and analyzing different load types. And maybe this is a loaded question, but how much do we know about the highest or the mechanism and the load on the spine that has the highest chance of creating injury? Is it axial compression? Is it bending? Is it shear? Is it axial twist? Some kind of combination? Are there movements that we need to be a little bit more wary of when we're just starting out with them, type thing? Or where's your take on that?
I understand the question, and I have to go back to who is the person in front of us that we want to apply that answer to. So it depends on the person. It depends on the number of reps and sets that we're talking about.
Okay.
What other exercises are they doing
right.
life that compounds, say, let's say shear is the variable, that compounds shear, and they keep doing this that adds more shear. They do that keeps adding more shear, unbeknownst to the person who hasn't assessed all of this. Now, other things really matter. So with your engineering background, Greg, you will appreciate this. We could take a thin willow branch and bend that thin branch over and over again with no stress, no risk of injury. Would you apply 100 pounds or kilos to that willow branch and expect it to sustain compression? No, it's going to break right away.
For sure.
Now let me change the structure just a tiny bit. Let's take a thicker branch. We can even use a branch that's hollow. Doesn't matter.
Sure.
And we're going to bend it. It will shatter right away, because the stress is the radial distance from the neutral axis. In other words, the thicker the rod, the easier it is to break in bending, but it also is more strong in compression. And that's exactly what we see in spines. So when you look at a middle linebacker in the NFL, by process of elimination, you're looking at a thicker spine.
Sure.
Now, would you do 100 sit-ups with an offensive tackle who weighs 400 pounds in the NFL?
Yeah, maybe not.
You see, that wouldn't be it wouldn't be the best choice, because that spine is already vulnerable in bending.
Yeah.
But takes tremendous compressive load because of its anatomy or architecture, however you want to look at that.
Yeah.
So now you're seeing why it's very difficult for me to say, compression is the worst. Bending is the worst. But that's on an individual basis. When we go to industrial studies, my PhD mentor, Bob Norman, University of Waterloo, did a very large scale study at General Motors, where they measured psychosocial variables. Did the workers report good a rapport with their bosses? Did they get good progress or performance reports, and all these kinds of psychosocial variables? But they also measured biomechanical variables, and they put them into a multivariate analysis, which is simply a statistical weighing machine to see what variable is the most important. And that's the crux of your question. But we're not looking at individuals. We are looking at GM auto workers who every minute repeat their job. So, I'm going to hang the door on this car, and the next car is in front of them in a minute, bzz, 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 and then next minute, etc. So it's a 1 minute duty cycle. So if we look at auto workers on a 1 minute duty cycle, of all the variables you just mentioned, shear turned out to be the most potent out of the statistical multivariate analysis. Not only that, the amount of shear was 500 newtons. So if you repeatedly did a task that exposed your spine every minute to over 500 newtons, which is 50 kilo approximately, of shear, your membership in that group who is going to miss time off work because of back injury, greatly elevated. So do you see how, again,
that's a really good explanation.
Go to the individual and then into groups. And I could, we did a study. Well, not a study, actually. This was a case control study where we looked at NHL hockey players. And these were just hockey players who came to us because they had back injury. But we studied every single one of them. And out of those out of the many NHL hockey players that we'd seen over the years, 5 of them had a sportsman's hernia. And what that is, it's a tear of the oblique muscles, usually external oblique, but sometimes internal oblique as well. Never transverse abdominis, but the 2 oblique muscles. And then we went back and looked at their pre-training camp fitness scores. Now, the thought of prevention comes to mind. Of the 5 who had sportsman's hernias later in the season, not one of them had a side plank score of greater than 1 minute. Now, you have to ask yourself, I'm an old man. I can hold a side plank 1 minute. What does an NHL hockey player doing in their training that they don't have core fitness to hold the side plank
that is wild.
1 minute.
Yeah.
Isn't that wild?
It is.
So now let's create the hypothesis now that you should be able to hold a side plank for over a minute, because it appears to be prophylactic for future injury. In that case, a core muscle injury. And that turned out to be true. Not only that, if you can't hold the side plank for 1 minute, you're more likely to break into back pain sitting at a computer.
Right.
You're more likely to break into back pain just standing still for a period of time, talking to a colleague. So that 1 minute threshold for a side plank seems to be a pretty good rough indicator.
Right.
Yeah. So anyway, there's
I love that.
Yeah.
That's a really nice segue. I was going to start to ask you about the big three, the curl up, the side bridge, and the bird dog. So I was curious. I mean, you kind of almost answered that question and how you described that, but I wanted to know more about how you develop these techniques. I like that I love these exercises, by the way. I think they're great, and they're functional for the purpose of core, mostly like isometric, which kind of builds functional strength and kind of works well. Bird dog kind of works in the movement. Talk about how you develop these as your big three, and what makes them so effective at not only rehabbing back injuries, but also preventing them.
Going back 30 years ago, we were starting to realize, because of our observations, one of the first studies we ever did was a video fluoroscope study of top powerlifters, and it was at the Popeyes powerlifting gym in Kitchener. You might remember Popeyes, which was an old heavy metal gym.
Yeah, I do.
I know they've modernized it, but in those days it was a pretty gritty, very strong men and women. Actually, there were no women. There was one or two, but this was a pretty gritty, heavy metal gym.
Yeah.
And we took some of those boys who, some of them were lifting Canadian records back in those days. And we video fluoroscoped their spines as they were lifting. And we happened to film one fella getting an injury. And what happened, just at one joint, it flexed a little bit. And then that one joint, just at the single joint, it flexed. What was the injury mechanism? Because, he dropped the weight. He said, hurt back. The spine buckled.
Right.
And that was this was late 80s. And this just rocked my world. The spine didn't injure, too much compression. The spine buckled. That joint became unstable, insufficient stiffness, and it toppled and it buckled. And it was back to an unbuckled state after about a second. But the point is, we captured it on film, and we then I would look at whiplash victims who were accused by the medical profession of not having anything wrong with their necks because their MRIs looked fine. But when I then collaborated with a colleague who would video fluoroscope their spine, we would take their necks through the range of motion, and you would see the vertebrae bending, and then you'd get through the mid-range, and then clunk in a micro move.
Wow.
And that clunk, they go, ugh, as they got through the range of motion. In other words, injury causes a loss of stiffness. If you damage your knee ligaments, you get laxity and micro movements in your knee, and that triggers pain. It's the same with the spine, and this has gone really unrecognized. And I know a lot of people deny this, but I don't think they've done the investigative work and made the observations that we have. So early on, I realized I need exercises and a way to train the brain to restore guiding stiffness, arrest the micro movements. So we kept looking for exercises that were highly tolerable. They didn't challenge the spine. They didn't put it into deviated postures. A lot of people, we could morph the exercises. And the three that kept bubbling up was there was no single best stabilization exercise. We had to do one for the back, one for the sides, and one for the front. And that's how we converged on the big three. And, I just, a little case in point, I had one of the icons of Canadian rock music here yesterday. We're at BackFit Pro HQ.
Oh, cool.
And he's an older fella now. But just marvelous too. My wife said, "Oh, I saw him on stage when I was in high school."
That's awesome.
But anyway, he was here yesterday, and I gave him a frontal plane shear instability test, which is I hook his shoulder into my armpit, I reach around and grab his opposite pelvis, and I pull him lateral, trying to create a little bit of a micro move. And I say, "Does that hurt?" And he says, "Yep, that's my familiar pain." A bit of micro movement from a sheer frontal plane insult. And then I said, "Take your fingers, poke them into your lateral oblique muscles, lateral to your navel. Poke them in hard. Now push them out." Good. Now I repeated the test, and his pain was gone.
Wow.
So immediately we found a muscular bracing. Now this guy, remember, he's an icon of music. He knows tuning. So I kept using that word.
Yeah. Tune
that controlling brace to arrest the micro movements and eliminate your pain. But if you do it too much, you start crushing your spine. That's not a good thing. If you don't do it enough, you will suffer the pain.
To find that kind of happy dose. Yeah.
So you find the happy dose. And it was such a, well, as you can imagine, fun. Oh, and by the way, next time I see him, we're going to play guitar together. Remember I said whoever I work with, I'm going to show them something, and he's going to show me something. It is. He saw I've got so much fun. But anyway, there's an example of then when we did the bird dog, I said, "Do you remember the brace that took your pain away? Get on all fours and do it now. Now, extend. Make a fist, squeeze, radiate into your back."
Yeah.
He did it all pain-free.
That's amazing.
And yet he knew about the bird dog. He'd done it with his therapist, but his therapist didn't understand what they hadn't assessed. They hadn't truly understood the mechanism of his pain. But once he came here, it was just another level of defining that pain mechanism. And remember when we were talking about the Jefferson, find the exercise, which is a tool to very specifically address the goal.
Right.
It's just an example. But anyway, the big three, you can morph them and coach them, program them to make them tolerable, arrest the micro, allow
very low risk. Yeah.
Very low risk. Allow the lifter, if you're talking a lifter, learn how to brace and tune the stiffness to carry even more weight pain-free in a back squat, or whatever the example is.
Sure.
And the last thing about that is one of transference. I was asked to write a little story about this a little while ago, so it's fresh in my mind. But the dean came to me about 20 years ago at the university and said, "I'd like you to start an experiment, start seeing patients." I thought, oh, goodness. Sorry, where was no, I've lost my train of thought. Stiffness exercises and yes. Yeah. And then I wrote out why this clinic is going different. And one of the things that made it different was we followed up with every patient that we ever saw. So we learned, did they comply with what we gave them to do? What did we give them? What was their subcategory of specific pain triggers? And how were they after 2 years? Did we make a difference in their lives, or are we just blowing smoke?
Right.
If they fit into the category that you've tried everything, the last thing for you is spine surgery. So we would get a lot of patients who said, "Look, I've been to the chiro, the physio, the osteopath. I've been to the psychologist. The last thing for me is surgery." So if that's your category, we would then work with them to stabilize the core, arrest the micro, mobilize the shoulders and the hips, give them movement strategies to spare their spine for tying their shoes, even having sex. We had a manual on that. Anyway, but the big three was part of that. And then now I can give the efficacy data.
Sure.
After 2 years, if you were in the category that only spine surgery left for you, but you avoided the surgery and we did all the rest, including the big three, 95% of 2-year follow-up said that they didn't have the surgery.
That's incredible.
Glad that they did.
Wow. Fair enough. So the proof is in the pudding.
Well, only for that specific.
Sure. Yeah. No, that's
all I can speak about.
Yeah, that's totally fair though. I love that. So we're running a little later than I was hoping, but I want to talk a little bit about the Superman / McKenzie method. You talk specifically about this, and this is kind of like a staple. I don't know. This might still be in the core curriculum in chiropractic training in Canada. It's almost like presented as this global fix exercise for back pain. You've actually studied the loads that happen in a global extension or Superman. It seems like it's corrective in some cases, and probably to your point, it depends on what else is happening and the specifics of the injury and the other individual. But you're not a fan of the global extension Superman. So talk a bit about that and the mechanism and when it can be helpful maybe, and why you don't recommend it necessarily.
Yeah. Okay. Let me just start that by giving a context.
Sure.
Let's assume the clinician gives the Superman exercise to the patient and they get better. Everyone's happy. I'm happy. That's wonderful. But that means I would never see them. I only see the failures. Mm-hmm. So I hope that gives a context for what I'm going to say. So these are people who've been unsuccessful with these so-called traditional approaches. Mm-hmm. And then I measure them and I'll say, arch back. Oh yeah, there's my pain.
Yeah.
Why on earth would you give them an exercise that hyperextends their spine and then loads it with a lot of
just
compression?
Do more of the thing that's hurting you. That'll make you better.
So if we replaced the Superman with a bird dog, for example, on all fours, you can now modulate the curve of their spine, get more tolerable. So there's the first reason.
Yeah.
We then did a study on spines, and these were cadaveric pig spines.
Okay.
But nonetheless, we then used a few human specimens to make sure that the results were still applicable to humans. And it turns out they were. It was a good model to study. Mm-hmm. So, we can raise 50 identical pigs in Waterloo County. That's easy. Anyway, we would then take those spines and we would flex them over and over again under a certain amount of compression load and create a partial disc herniation. So we would watch an X-ray. We would put a radio opaque barium material into the disc, and we'd watch it slowly progress through the delaminations of the disc. So now they're getting a partial disc herniation.
Right.
And then we would do a Superman, or we would do a McKenzie prone press up exercise. And we could reverse the hydraulics, vacuum in the nucleus that was starting to propagate through the delaminations of the annulus under one condition. If the disc had 70% of its original height remaining or more. In other words, if the disc was flattened, the hydraulics don't work.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened with McKenzie directional therapy. It can be absolutely magical for some acute herniated discs.
Right.
However, it can also make a mess of things as well. So there's a little bit, if you've got a really flattened disc, the chance of making it more of a mess is much greater. Now, the next issue became, if you keep doing prone press-ups, and they have 70% of their original disc height remaining, chances are you're going to start to reverse the posterior disc bulge, which is a good thing.
Sure.
I'm not really against it that much, but what I am against it is the therapist then says to the patient, do those every day for the next 2 years. And now here's what happens. Got a flattened disc, more load is on the facet joints. In 2 years, you have a extension intolerant patient because you've traumatized and overused the facet joints.
That makes sense.
Don't do it. So then our next experiment was to create the partial disc herniations and simply position the cadaveric spine as if the person was just laying prone without the dynamic push-ups. We might put 2 fists under the chin. They might go on their elbows, although we don't, believe it or not, we never do that with patients anymore either. We find it's not necessary. Lay on the table prone, breathe in, and as you exhale, just surrender all the tension, and you will find you will get a very gentle restoration of lordosis, simply doing that. Now, some people may have to put their hands under their hips to make that position a bit more tolerable. Craig, we got exactly the same efficacy score doing the prone tummy lay as we ever did with the Mackenzie press-ups.
Oh, wow.
Without traumatizing the facet joints.
That's wild.
So very now cool. We've converged on don't do press-ups.
Yeah.
Sorry, some people are going to hate me for this. But we've now found it's still a directional therapy.
Yeah.
You know, the Mackenzieists are happy. It's still theirs.
Yeah.
However, the motion didn't seem to add much. Just lay prone and breathe in the manner that I'm describing.
Yeah.
And we got exactly the same reversal and disc bulges following exactly the same rule as long as 70% of the disc height remains.
That's incredible. Very cool. Amazing. I want to ask you a little bit about BackFit Pro. I know you have a bunch of courses and services going on. What is the mission basically for 2022 for what you guys have going on at BackFit Pro?
COVID changed everything.
It's changed the scope a little bit.
It has changed the world in the most profound ways. But now, I mean, I will say this: I know some people have suffered terribly, but my kids came home. My daughter was living in Australia. My son was in New York. They came home and lived with me for 5 months.
Oh, wow.
I never thought as adults I'd ever get that opportunity. So that was, such a blessing. So in that way, COVID was great for me. But as far as BackFit Pro, I'd spent 30 years on the road. Once a month, I was somewhere teaching. So that all stopped. And then we found Zoom. And I put our courses online, and we still have the skills developed, the hands skills of coaching exercise, and all the things that we do. And we learned that we could put that into small sessions with our instructors, just 5 on the screen once, and we could teach that way. I didn't think we could, but it worked out really well. So now that we're in 2022, we've started to put on the summit courses again, with one on the foundation of how the spine works and pain pattern recognition and all this sort of stuff, and then how to assess back pain, and then how to morph in performance and that kind of thing. That's a 4-day event. So we're just starting our first one again in Holland, but my instructors are going over to do all the hands-on skills in-person training, and I can Zoom in to do the lectures. And
amazing.
It doesn't matter. So this has really changed my life. So we're getting back to doing those courses. And I still see the odd, interesting sort of the celebrity patient, I guess, here at BackFit Pro HQ. And we've got our network of trained clinicians on our website that if people want to access what we do, they can go and see if who's the clinician closest to them on our website.
That's great. Awesome.
So
very cool.
That's where we are now. And
awesome.
I'll see patients 2 days a week, and the other few days I will go fishing or whatever.
Finally getting to enjoy some retirement life. Awesome. Let's so that kind of segues into your own habits. It was so I'm curious to know. I'm sure a lot of your kind of priority lies in around your own kind of back health. That's kind of what you're surrounded by. But I'm curious to know what else is at the top of your list of your health and fitness priorities these days, and what do your habits look like around that?
Well, I'm actually more structured than most people think. I live what I call the biblical training week, which is 2 days a week I'll strength train. 2 days a week I work on ability. And I must say, when I was 30, I lifted heavy. I didn't need any mobility. I had plenty. I was quite fine. But now I'm in my mid 60s. The years have caught up to me, and I have to work on my neck, my shoulders, hips, etc. And then 2 days a week, I do something for my old ticker, something cardiovascularly challenging. Now, the last few days, I've been splitting firewood next year. So I've just checked the boxes on all 3.
Still counts.
Yeah. And the other rule I live by is don't do something heavy and challenging 2 days in a row. And then I never get sore.
Yeah.
And then why it's the biblical week is the seventh day I don't do anything.
Hmm.
And I remember, my dad, Sundays, business, no work, just don't.
Just chill.
And you look at every major religion, they have a day of rest.
True.
And, but what do the kids do now? Go and blow out at the gym.
Yeah.
That day of rest and say, oh, well, it was my day of rest. I only ran 5K.
Yeah.
And I just shake my head and I think, yeah, well, I guess now I know why you're
only went to 70% today.
That's right. Yeah. And they train like crazy,
mm-hmm.
not realizing that they're only training to create adaptations which occur when they rest, and they're failing to give appropriate rest.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I think about my training. And, if I'm splitting firewood, great. And if I don't, I'm into HQ here and I'll do a few things.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Stu, this has been an amazing chat. Really appreciate the time. What's the best place for people to learn more from your work?
Just go to our website, backfitpro.com.
Awesome. We will link to that in the show notes. Well, thanks again for the time. I really appreciate it.
Okay, Craig, it was great to catch up to you and say hi to your mom and dad.
I will. Absolutely.
That's a lot of fun.
For sure. All right, guys. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Healthspan Academy, and we'll see you next time. Hey, what's up, guys? Thanks for tuning in today. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Thank you so much for supporting this channel. This has been a fun project. We're growing in viewership every single week, and we obviously couldn't do that without you. So thank you for continuing to tune in. I really hope you're getting value out of the programming and the content. Just wanted to give you a heads up. I've been working on a book on health and longevity the last couple of years, been collaborating with my colleague, Dr. Dan Vitale, who's an expert in the field as well. And we've basically just kind of summarized the literature, some of the techniques that we found really useful in the world of biohacking, what our exercise regimen looks like, what's, cardio type stuff is going to help us live longer and healthier, mobility work, nutrition. We've covered the whole spectrum, everything that you can basically be in control of in your health and fitness kind of moving forward to help you live as healthily as possible for as long as possible. And it's available free for download. So if you click on the YouTube banner, you'll see a link to download the blueprint. It's also on our Instagram profile or on the website. You can click on 5pillarmethod.com/optimize to get your free copy of the book. And I hope you enjoy it. Hope you're keeping well. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.